In this section, I'm going to show you the new Instrument Rack 2.0 and how it interacts with MIDI tracks and with instrument tracks. And to do so, let's start a brand new Cubase project. So I'm going to go under the File pull-down menu, select New, and then I'm going to choose the Empty template from the More category. And I'm going to go into my Projects folder, and I'm going to make a new folder called Rack. And then I'm going to click Open and save this project with the exact same name, Rack R01. Now, to understand how cool Instrument Rack 2.0 is, let me refresh your memory about how instrument tracks and the instrument rack used to work. Let's go ahead and start this project with a brand new instrument track. So I'm going to right or control click on the track column and choose Add Instrument Track. Then I'm going to open the browser and I'm going to choose a synth pad from Sonic SE, and I'll just select the one I had used recently, which is the analog pad. When I double click on that, it does everything the same way it used to in previous versions of Cubase. It makes an instrument track upon which is assigned the Sonic SE instrument that the analog pad comes from. And if I wanted to get to that instrument's control panel, I would click the Edit Instrument button, and now I'm looking at Sonic SE2's control panel. But you'll notice that there's only one sound loaded into the multi-program rack. There are 16 additional slots, but this was the biggest disadvantage to using instrument tracks in previous versions of Cubase, in that you could only have one track assigned to the first slot of any multi-timbral VST instrument. So that meant that you couldn't address all of these other sounds on different MIDI channels. They could be on the same MIDI channels for creating layers and splits and so forth, but if you wanted to have different sounds on different MIDI channels inside of this instance of Sonic SE, you couldn't do it. To do that, we'd need to load an instrument into the rack, and you can get to the rack by going to the Devices pull-down menu and selecting VST Instruments or selecting F11. That will call up the rack. Now, the rack automatically looks very different in Cubase 7.5, and I'll explain why in a moment. But if you wanted to use multiple MIDI tracks along with one instance of a multi-timbral instrument like Sonic SE, you'd need to load Sonic SE into the rack. So I'm going to come down here to Rack Instruments and click this little drop-down box. I'm going to go to Sonic SE, which is located in the Synth category right here. So I'm going to load that up, and it's going to ask me if I want to create a MIDI track for that instance of Sonic SE in the rack. I'm going to click on Create. And now what I can do, when I move this out of the way to make it a little bit easier to see, I could load one sound into the first rack. So, like, let's go with bass sounds. Let's go with the acid lead here. That will load that sound into the first slot. And since we had Cubase automatically create a MIDI track for us that's assigned to MIDI channel number 1 of Sonic SE, that's going to route that track's MIDI signal into this first slot. So if we wanted to add more instruments and more tracks, we could just add them to the other MIDI channel assigned slots inside of Sonic SE. So let's go with Angry Kitten. That sounds like a good one. On the second channel, and then on the third channel, we'll assign another one. So let's go with Analog Power. So now we have 3 different sounds assigned to the first 3 slots of the multi-program rack, and we can make new MIDI channels and assign them to those channel output destinations. So I'm going to right or control click and add another MIDI track. Actually, let's add 2 MIDI tracks. And then we can go through this track and tell it that it's going to go to Sonic SE, but it's going to go on channel number 2. The third track is going to go to channel number 3, or we could reassign that to any MIDI channel that we wanted to, but they correspond with the numbers of these slots. So now if we select and record enable the first slot, we'll hear the bass acid synth. So if we wanted to hear the second sound in the second slot, let's go to the second MIDI channel. Now we'll hear Angry Kitten. And then if we wanted to hear the third sound, we would record enable that third track. Now we'll hear Analog Power. So that's how you used to have to address multiple instruments inside of a multi-timbral VST instrument. But not anymore. Now you can actually address that other instance of Halion-Sonic SE that was created when we made that analog pad instrument track, and it's all done from inside Instrument Rack 2.0. Watch what they've done. If I go back to the VST instrument rack, you can see that there are two different instances of Halion-Sonic SE in the rack. Because before, VST instruments that were created when you used instrument tracks were not loaded into the rack, but now they are, which means that you can actually add more MIDI instrument tracks to address the track instruments that are part of your Cubase project. You can even rename them to keep them apart. For example, if we wanted to make this leads, then we'll change the name there. And if we come down here to the second instance of Halion-Sonic SE, we'll call this basses. That will help us keep them apart a little bit, but you can still see the instrument from which they come originally right here in the lower right-hand corner of each name. And you'll notice that Instrument Rack 2.0 has been bisected by this heading. This shows you track instruments in the top part of the instrument rack and rack instruments in the bottom part. Now, in the next tutorial, I'll show you more about the MIDI routing, so I'll stop right here for now. But Instrument Rack 2.0 is a great way to manage all of your track instruments and rack instruments from one specific location. So in the next tutorial, I'm going to show you how to route tracks into VST Instrument Rack 2.0.